Okay, so welcome to episode 4 of my oddly titled podcast, Mr. K is Wrong. So this time we're going to be debunking foreign influence myths and presenting some truth about US aid, the Federal Reserve, and military profiteering. And this is because somebody I know named, let's just call him Mr. K, but I knew him, back in my high school days. He was an all right person at the time, or so I thought. And, even though we would have disagreed on a fair amount of things, he was probably more of a moderate Republican type in my eyes. And since those days, like 20 years ago that I knew him, he's just gone further and further down a far right rabbit hole. And he's been making, misleading posts on Facebook and spreading all kinds of disinformation and misinformation, whatever you care to call it. And this time, this particular meme that he posted deals with U.S. aid, the Federal Reserve, and military profiteering. Sorry, I guess Federal Reserve is a bit of a tongue twister for me, but anyway, um, as I've done numerous times here already, I asked ChatGPT if it could debunk Mr. K's claims. So, in addition to me being lazy as an explanation for why I do that, it's also to show that if even ChatGPT can debunk whatever this Mr. K is posting, it's probably not that strong of an argument because ChatGPT is mostly a middle of the ground sort of thing. It doesn't really give, you know, extremely far left answers and that sort of thing. It just, kind of plays it safe when it addresses a topic. And in this case, it did a pretty solid job of debunking Mr. K's talking points. So I had asked ChatGPT, could you debunk this right wing meme from Trump's supporter? At the top, Elon Musk asks, good question. Why is funding for other countries being prioritized over Americans in dire need? Below that, someone with the screen name Mindy MF Robinson is quoted as saying, because most of our federal government is being controlled by foreign interests, even our money system, the not so Federal Reserve, is a private foreign entity that profits off sending our best men overseas to fight wars so they can profit and money launder the foreign aid. So I also directed ChatGPT in my little question, as part of debunking this, can you tell me whether or not Donald Trump let anyone fight wars overseas? And if no corporation drew disproportionate benefit under Donald Trump, did he have no foreign interests, such as Saudi Arabia or Israel, draw benefit from his administration? So, this is the result from ChatGPT. So it said, let's break down the meme and provide a fact-based debunking. So, that's a pretty cool way to start the answer. I don't want to praise ChatGPT that much, but it had style this time, the result. So, number one, it addressed Elon Musk's comment on prioritizing foreign aid. So here's what ChatGPT said about that. The claim that funding for other countries is prioritized over Americans in dire need is misleading. U.S. foreign aid accounts for a small fraction of the federal budget, around 1%, much of which goes to defense, disaster relief, and diplomatic efforts that benefit U.S. interests globally. Now, I might actually kind of step in here and question what exactly U.S. interests means, and ChatGPT doesn't really elaborate on that, so it does sound kind of propagandistic. But I'm going to put that aside for the moment and continue with what ChatGPT said. So it notes that domestic programs like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid receive vastly more funding. Foreign aid is often allocated to countries for strategic reasons, including national security, economic partnerships, or humanitarian relief. These expenditures are not a straightforward choice between helping Americans or sending funds abroad. They often serve broader national interests, including stability and security for Americans at home. Now, again, I might wonder what exactly they mean by that. Like stability in what sense, security in what sense. All that kind of stuff. But it's still a fair enough answer so far. And number two, the Federal Reserve and foreign control. The assertion that the Federal Reserve is a private foreign entity is a common conspiracy theory. In reality, the Federal Reserve is an independent central bank created by Congress. It operates with significant oversight, with decisions made by the Board of Governors and the Federal Open Market Committee, whose members are appointed by the U.S. President and confirmed by the Senate. The claim that it is foreign and is false. It is a U.S. institution, though it collaborates internationally like other central banks. So ChatGPT really does a pretty solid job of, pointing that, the Federal Reserve is actually created by the United States government, which I think a lot of people don't seem to understand. They sort of just see it as like a spooky foreign thing when in fact that the government still does have control over it. You might argue that that Federal Reserve is a flawed institution or something like that, but you don't need to really make it sound spookier than it is, right? You could still try to debunk it without making it seem like some foreign spooky boogeyman. So anyway, ChatGPT continues with point number three, which is sending Americans to fight wars overseas. Donald Trump's role in military engagements. During Trump's presidency, U.S. military forces remained engaged overseas. For example, Trump maintained military presence in the Middle East, notably in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, where U.S. troops continued so called counterterrorism operations. Now, I added the so called part to that. That's not ChatGPT right now. But anyway, it continues. The Trump administration escalated conflicts, including the 2017 airstrike in Syria in response to chemical weapons or weapon attacks by the Assad regime, and the 2020 targeted killing of Iranian General Soleimani. So, while Trump often talked about ending endless wars, U.S. involvement in overseas military operations continued under his leadership. So that's a very important thing that ChatGPT got into right there. You know, some foolish people out there will think that, oh, Donald Trump was some peacemaker, but remember the assassination of that Iranian general, that was basically an act of war. I mean, could you imagine if, some foreign government assassinated one of our generals? How would we feel about that? It's it's a very curious thing to claim that an act like that is from a peacemaker or something like that. But plenty of American voters still fall for that whole thing. So anyway, ChatGPT continues. Point number four: corporations profiting from wars under Trump. So it notes that military contractors and defense companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon continue to benefit under Trump's administration, just as they had under previous administrations. Trump's significant increases in defense spending and arms sales, particularly to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, fueled corporate interests and profits. Defense companies and private contractors involved in military logistics, arms production, and services saw sustained and, in some cases, increased business during Trump's tenure. So, again, ChatGPT knocks it out of the park with this one. It's true that, in fact, Trump bragged about increasing the size and scope of the military. So to depict him as, somebody who's not at all tied in with any foreign interests or involved in war profiteering is totally absurd. He was doing all those things despite what some of his backers would claim. So that leads to point number 5. ChatGPT continues, noting things about foreign interests benefiting from Trump. So it says, despite rhetoric about America first, Trump's administration had ties and dealings with that benefited foreign interests. So Saudi Arabia is an example they give, inspired by me mentioning that. Trump maintained a close relationship with Saudi Arabia, particularly Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, despite international outcry over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. His administration continued to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, despite opposition from Congress due to Saudi involvement in the Yemen conflict. Then it gets into Israel. Trump's policies strongly favored Israel. Well, the far right contingent of Israel, that is. And this includes moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. These actions were widely seen as political benefits to the Israeli government. And again, I need to interject here and say to the far right components of the Israeli government. And, unfortunately, those are the dominant parts of the government, but, you know, presumably there could be some more moderate interests that could have power in Israel and, other countries that are currently dominated by the far right. So while this is ChatGPT continuing, by the way, while Trump frequently claimed to be fighting for American workers, foreign governments, and defense contractors, undeniably reaped benefits during this time in office. So it concludes by saying the meme propagates several false or misleading ideas. The US government is not controlled by foreign interests, and the Federal Reserve is not a private or not a foreign entity. So, you know, ChatGPT basically debunks that idea because, again, it was created through an act of Congress. If Congress really wanted to, it could actually presumably get rid of the Federal Reserve. So, there's not necessarily, anything spooky about it beyond what our government has created. And tellingly, Donald Trump did not get rid of the Federal Reserve. So, moving on, U.S. military engagements did not end under Trump, and defense corporations continued to profit under his administration as they had under previous administrations. And foreign governments such as Saudi Arabia and Israel benefited significantly from Trump's policies. Again, the far right contingents of those governments. Ultimately, this meme recycles disinformation and conspiracy theories that distort the actual complexity of U.S. foreign policy and economics. So basically, it's been thoroughly debunked.